This is Part 3, Volume 1 of the new and complete Newgate Calendar, read by Roy Schreiber. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Particular account of the life and amours of Mary Adams, who was executed at Tyburn for privately stealing. This young woman, who was the daughter of a journeyman shoemaker, was born at Reading in Berkshire, and when she was old enough to go to service, went to live with a grocer in that town. As Mary was a girl of vivacity and genteel figure, she soon attracted the regard of the grocer's son, and the confequence of their connection became very conspicuous in a short time. As soon as it was evident that she was pregnant, she was difmissed from her mafter's fervice, on which she immediately made oath that his fon was the father of the child thereafter to be born, a circumftance that compelled the old gentleman to fupport her till after she was brought to bed. She soon had been delivered before she went to London, and entered into the fervice of a mercer in Cheapfide, where, by prudent conduct, she might have retrieved the character she had forfeited in the country. But prudence was not among the number of her virtues, for though she had already fuffered from her indifcretion, an intimacy soon subfifted between her mafter and herself. But as their affociations could not conveniently be held at home, they contrived to meet on evenings at other places, when the miftrefs of the houfe was gone to the theatre or out on a visit. This connection continued till the girl was far advanced in her pregnancy, when the mafter, apprehenfive of difagreeable confequences at home, advifed the girl to quarrel with her miftrefs, in order that she might be difmissed, and then took a lodging for her at Hackney, where she remained till she was delivered, and in the mean time the connection between her and her mafter continued as before. Being brought to bed of a child that died a few hours after its birth, the mafter thought himfelf happy, fuppofing he could eafily free himfelf from the encumbrance of the mother, of whom he now began to be heartily tired. When the girl recovered from her lying in, he told her that she muft go into fervice, and it did not fuit him to maintain her any longer. But this enraged her to the higheft degree, and fhe threatened to difcover the nature of their connection to his wife, unlefs he would make her a prefent of 20 guineas. And with this demand he thought it prudent to comply, happy to get rid of her even on fuch terms. Being now in poffeffion of money, and in no want of clothes in which to make a genteel appearance, fhe removed from Hackney to Wych Street without Temple Bar, but was fcarcely fettled in her new lodgings before fhe fent a letter to the mercer's wife, whom fhe acquainted with the nature of the connection that had fubfifted between her late mafter and herfelf, but fhe did not mention her place of abode in this letter. The confequence was, the mercer was obliged to acknowledge the crime of which he had been guilty, and folicit his wife's pardon in terms of the utmoft humiliation. This pardon was promifed, but whether it was ever ratified remains a doubt. Mrs. Adams had the advantage of an engaging figure, and paffing as a young widow in her new lodgings, fhe was foon married to a young fellow in the neighbourhood, but it was not long before he difcovered the impofition that had been put upon him, on which he embarked on board a fhip in the Royal Navy. By this time Mrs. Adams' money was almoft expended, but as her clothes were yet good, an attorney of Clement's Inn took her into keeping, and after fhe had lived a fhort time with him, fhe went to another of the fame profeffion, with whom fhe cohabited above 2 years. But on his marriage fhe was once more abandoned to feek her fortune. Fertile of invention, and too proud to condefcend to accept of a common fervice, fhe became connected with a notorious bawd of Drury Lane, who was very glad of her affiftance, and promised herself considerable advantages from the affociation. In this fituation Mrs. Adams difplayed her charms to considerable advantage, and was happy as any common proftitute can expect to be. But, alas! what is this happiness but a prelude to the extremity of mifery and diftrefs? Such indeed it was found by Mrs. Adams, who having been gratified by a gentleman with a considerable fum of money, the bawd quarrelled with her respecting the dividing of it, and a battle enfuing, our heroine was turned out of the houfe after fhe had got a black eye in the conteft. After this fhe used to parade in the park in the day time, and walk the ftreets in the evenings in fearch of cafual lovers. But as fhe joined the practice of theft to that of incontinence, few of her chance acquaintance efcaped being robbed. She was often taken into cuftody for thefe practices, but continually efcaped through defect of evidence. At length an end was put to her depredations, for having enticed a gentleman to a bagnio near Covent Garden, fhe picked his pocket of all his money and a bank note to a large amount, and left him while he flept. When the gentleman awaked, he fent immediately notice to the bank to ftop payment, and as Mrs. Adams came foon afterwards to receive the money for the note, fhe was taken into cuftody and lodged in prifon, and being in a fhort time tried at the Old Bailey, fhe was convicted, received fentence of death, and was executed at Tyburn on the 16th of June, 1702. After her conviction, fhe lived in the fame gay and dissipated manner that fhe had done before, and was vifited by many of her former acquaintance, who fupplied her with money to fupport her extravagance. Agreeable to her own requeft too, their miftaken bounty contributed to purchafe her a fuit of mourning, in which fhe was executed. And they buried her in as handfome a manner as if her life had been conducted by the rules of virtue, and fhe had likewife been a woman of fortune. Interefting particulars respecting John Peter Dramatti, who was hanged at Tyburn for the murder of his wife. The unhappy fubject of this narrative was the fon of Proteftant parents, and born at Saverdun in the county of Foix in the province of Languedoc in France. He received a religious education, and when he arrived at years of maturity, he left his own country on account of the persecution then prevailing there, and went to Geneva. From thence he travelled into Germany, and ferved as a horfe grenadier under the Elector of Brandenburg, who was afterwards king of Prussia. When he had been in this fphere of life about a year, he came over to England, and entered into the fervice of Lord Haverfham, with whom he remained about 12 months, and then enlifted as a soldier in the regiment of Colonel de la Mornoniere. And having made 2 campaigns in Flanders, the regiment was ordered into Ireland, where it was broke, in confequence of which Dramatti obtained his liberty. He now became acquainted with a widow, between 50 and 60 years of age, who, pretending fhe had a great fortune, and allied to the royal family of France, he foon married her, on account of her fuppofed wealth and rank, and her understanding of Englifh and Irifh, thinking it prudent to have a wife who could fpeak the languages of the country in which he proposed to spend the remainder of his life. He had not been long married before he found out he had been impofed upon, for his wife had no fortune at all, on which he took a fmall houfe and a piece of ground about 10 miles from Cork, intending to turn farmer. But being altogether ignorant of husbandry, he found it impoffible to fubfift by that profeffion, on which he went to Cork, and worked as a fkinner, being the trade to which he was brought up. At the expiration of a 12-month from his coming to that city, he went to London, and offering fervices again to Lord Haverfham, he was accepted, and in this fervice he remained till the perpetration of that crime which brought him to a fhameful end. The substance of the narrative that Dramatti gave of the caufe and confequence of the murder was as follows. His wife, unhappy on account of their feparate residence, wifhed to live with him at Lord Haverfham's, which he refufed to confent to, saying that his lordfhip did not know he was married. Hereupon fhe entreated him to quit his fervice, which he likewife refufed, saying that he could not provide himfelf fo well in any other fituation, and that it would be ungenerous to leave fo indulgent a mafter. The wife now began to evince the jealousy of her dispofition, and intimated that Dramatti had fixed his affection on fome other woman, and the following circumftance aggravated the malignant diforder that wrangled in her mind. Dramatti being attacked by a violent fever about the Chriftmas preceding the time that the murder was committed, his noble mafter gave orders that all poffible care should be taken of him at his lordfhip's expence. At this period Mrs. Dramatti paid a vifit to her hufband, and again urged him to quit his fervice, which he positively refufed. A fervant girl now came into the room, bringing him fome water gruel, and the wife, fufpecting that this was her rival in her husband's affections, once more entreated him to leave his place. In anfwer to which he faid he muft be out of his fences to abandon a fituation in which he was fo well provided for, and treated with fuch humanity. Dramatti having recovered of his illnefs, vifited his wife at her lodgings as often as was confiftent with the duties of his ftation; but this not being often enough as fhe wifhed him to come, fhe grew more uneafy than before. At length Lord Haverfham took lodgings at Kenfington, and Dramatti was fo bufy in packing up fome articles on the occafion, that he had no opportunity of acquainting his wife with their removal. At length fhe learnt this circumftance from another quarter, on which, inflamed to the higheft degree of rage, fhe went to Kenfington to reproach her hufband with his unkindnefs to her, though he declared he always maintained her as well as he was able, and as proof of it, had given her 3 guineas but a little time before the murder was committed. Frequent were the difputes between this unhappy man and his wife, till, on the 9th of June, Dramatti being fent to London, and his bufinefs lying near Soho, he called on his wife, who lodged in that neighbourhood, and having been with her fome time, he was about to take his leave, but fhe laid hold of him, and wanted to detain him; but he got from her, and went towards Charing Crofs, to which place fhe followed him, but at length fhe feemed to yield to his perfuafions that fhe should go home, as he told her that he was going to his lord in Spring Green; but inftead of going home, fhe went and waited for him at or near Hyde Park Gate, and in the evening he found her there as he was going to Kenfington. At the Park Gate fhe flopped him, and infifted that he should go no further unlefs he took her with him; and after many words had pafled between them, fhe faid fhe would go in fpite of his teeth, or elfe fhe would have his life, or he should have hers. He now left her, and went towards Chelsea, but fhe followed him till they came near Bloody Bridge, where the quarrel being vehemently renewed, fhe feized his neckcloth, and would have flangled him, whereupon he beat her moft unmercifully with his cane and fword, which latter he imagined fhe broke with her hands, as fhe was remarkable for her ftrength, and, if he had been unarmed, would eafily have overpowered him. Having wounded her in fo many places as to conclude he had killed her, his paffion immediately began to fubfide, and falling on his knees, he devoutly implored the pardon of God for the horrid fin of which he had been guilty, and then went to Kenfington, where his fellow fervants obferving that his clothes were bloody, he faid that he had been attacked by 2 men in Hyde Park, who would have robbed him of his clothes, but that he defended himfelf, and broke the head of one of them. This ftory was credited for the prefent, and on the following day Dramatti went to London, where he heard a paper cried in the ftreets refpecting the murder that had been committed, and though he dreaded being taken into cuftody every moment, he did not feek to make his efcape, but difpatched his bufinefs in London, and returned to Kenfington. On the following day the fervants heard a paper cried refpecting a barbarous murder that had been committed near Bloody Bridge, on which they told their lord of it, hinting that they fufpected Dramatti to have murdered his wife, as they had been known to quarrel before, and he had come home the preceding evening with his fword broke, the hilt of it bruifed, his cane fhattered, and fome blood on his clothes. Upon this Lord Haverfham, with a view to employ him that he might not think he was fufpected, bid him get the coach ready, and in the interim fent for a conftable, who, on fearching him, found a woman's cap in his pocket, which afterwards proved to have belonged to his wife. When he was examined before a juftice of the peace, he confeffed that he had committed the crime, but in extenuation of it, faid that his wife was a worthless woman, who had entrapped him into marriage by pretending to be of royal blood of France, and a woman of fortune. On his trial it appeared he went into Lord Haversham's chamber late on the night on which the murder was committed, after that nobleman was in bed, and it was fuppofed that he had an intention of robbing his lordfhip, who called out to know what he wanted. But in a folemn declaration Dramatti made after his conviction, he ftedfaftly denied any intention of robbing his mafter, but only went into the room to fetch a filver tumbler, which he had forgot, that he might have it in readiness to take in fome aff's milk in the morning for his lordfhip. The body of Mrs. Dramatti was found in a ditch between Hyde Park and Chelsea, and a track of blood was feen to the diftance of 20 yards, at the end of which a piece of a fword was found fticking in a bank, which fitted the other part of the fword in the prifoner's poffeffion. The circumftances attending the murder being proved to the fatisfaction of the jury, the culprit was found guilty, condemned, and on the 21ft of July, 1703, was executed at Tyburn, and yielded up his life a fincere penitent, not only with refpect to the crime for which he fuffered, but for all others of which he had been guilty. Narrative of the Life, Execution, and wonderful Recovery of John Smith, called Half hanged Smith, with cursory remarks on his extraordinary efcape. John Smith was the fon of a farmer at Malton, about 15 miles from the city of York, who bound him apprentice to a packer in London, with whom he ferved out his time, and afterwards worked as a journeyman. He then went to sea as a merchantman, after which he enlifted on board a man of war, and was at the famous expedition against Vigo, but on the return from that expedition he was liberated. Smith had not been long difengaged from the naval fervice, when he enlifted as a foldier in the regiment of guards commanded by Lord Cutts. But in this ftation he foon made bad connexions, and engaged with fome of his dissolute companions as a houfebreaker. On December 5th, 1705, he was arraigned on 4 different indictments, on 2 of which he was convicted and received fentence of death. While he lay under fentence, he feemed very little affected with his fituation, being amufed with the hopes of a reprieve through the intereft of his friends. An order, however, came for his execution on the 24th day of the fame month, in confequence of which he was carried to Tyburn, where he performed his devotions, and was turned off in the ufual manner. But when he was hung near 15 minutes, the people prefent cried out, "A reprieve! A reprieve!" Hereupon the malefactor was cut down, and being conveyed to a houfe in the neighbourhood, he foon recovered, in confequence of bleeding and other proper applications. As foon as he had recovered his fences, he was asked what were his feelings at the time of execution, to which he repeatedly replied in subftance as follows: that, "when he was turned off, he for fome time was fenfible of very great pain, occafioned by the weight of his body, and felt his fpirits in a ftrange commotion, violently preffing upwards. That having forced their way to his head, he, as it were, faw a great blaze or glaring light, which feemed to go out at his eyes with a flafh, and then he loft all fenfe of pain. That after he was cut down, and began to come to himfelf, the blood and fpirits forcing themfelves into their former channels, put him, by a fort of pricking or shooting to fuch intolerable pain that he could have wifhed thofe hanged who had cut him down." Smith, after this narrow efcape from the grave, pleaded to his pardon on the 20th of February. Yet fuch was his propensity to evil deeds, that he returned to his former practices, and being again apprehended, was tried at the Old Bailey for houfebreaking. But fome difficulties arifing in the cafe, the jury brought in a fpecial verdict, in confequence of which the affair was left to the opinion of 12 judges, who determined in favour of the prifoner. Notwithstanding the fecond extraordinary efcape, he was a third time indicted; but the profecutor happening to die before the day of trial, he once more obtained that liberty which his conduct proved to be fo unmerited. There is no account what became of this man after this third remarkable incident in his favour; but Christian charity inclines us to hope that he made a proper ufe of the fingular difpenfations of Providence fo ably evinced in his own perfon. Account of the Conviction, Trial, and Execution of Deborah Churchill, as an Accomplice in the Murder with Hunt. Deborah Churchill, whofe fate gives rife to this narrative, was born about the year 1678 in a village near Norwich. She had feveral children by her hufband, Mr. Churchill, but her temper not being calculated to afford him domeftic happinefs, he repined at his fituation, and deftroyed himfelf by intoxication. Deborah, after this event, came to London, and being too much idle and too proud to think of earning a fubfiftence by her induftry, fhe ran confiderably into debt, and in order to extricate herfelf from her encumbrances, had recourfe to a method which was formerly as common as it was unjuft. Going to a public houfe in Holborn, fhe faw a foldier, and asked if he would marry her. The man immediately anfwered in the affirmative, on which they went in a coach to the Fleet, where the nuptial knot was inftantly tied. Mrs. Churchill, whofe maiden name is unknown, having obtained a certificate of her marriage, enticed her hufband to drink till he was quite inebriated, and then gave him the flip, happy in this contrivance to fcreen herfelf from an arreft. A little after this, fhe cohabited with a young fellow named Hunt, with whom fhe lived more than 6 years. Hunt appears to have been a youth of a rakifh difpofition. He behaved very ill to this unhappy woman, who however loved him to diftraction, and at length forfeited her life in confequence of the regard that fhe had for him. One night, as Mr. Hunt and one of his affociates were returning from the theatre in company with Mrs. Churchill, a quarrel arofe between the men, who immediately drew their fwords. While Mrs. Churchill, anxious for the fafety of Mr. Hunt, interpofed, and kept his antagonist at a diftance, in confequence of which he received a wound, of which he died almoft immediately. No fooner was the murder committed than Hunt effected his efcape, and eluding his purfuers arrived fafely in Holland. But Mrs. Churchill was apprehended on the fpot, and being taken before a magiftrate, was committed to Newgate. November, 1708, at the feffions held at the Old Bailey, Mrs. Churchill was indicted as an accomplice on the act of the firft year of King James the Firft, called the Statute of Stabbing, by which it is enacted that, "if any one ftabs another, who hath not at that time a weapon drawn, or hath not firft ftricken, the party who ftabbed is deemed guilty of murder, if the perfon ftabbed died within 6 months afterwards." Mrs. Churchill, being convicted, pleaded a ftate of pregnancy in bar of her execution, and a jury of matrons being impanelled, declared that they were ignorant whether fhe was with child or not. Hereupon the court, willing to allow all reafonable time in a cafe of this nature, refpited judgment for 6 months, at the end of which time fhe received fentence of death, as there was no appearance of her being pregnant. This woman's behaviour was extremely penitent, but she denied her guilt to the last moment of her life, having no conception that she had committed murder, becaufe she did not herself ftab the deceafed. She was hanged at Tyburn on the 17th of December, 1708. Full account of the lives, infurrections, and execution of Daniel Damaree and George Purchas, who were hanged at Tyburn for high treafon. When the Whig miniftry of Queen Anne was turned out of, or, in the modern phrafe, had refigned their places, the Tory miniftry who fucceeded them encouraged a young divine named Henry Sacheverell to inflame the paffions of the public by preaching against the fettlement made at the Revolution, and inculcating all thofe doctrines which were then held as favourable tenets of what was called the High Church party. Sacheverell was a man of abilities, and eminently poffeffed of thofe kind of talents which are calculated to infpire fuch sentiments as the preacher wifhed to imprefs his auditors with. The public in general were well informed that Dr. Sacheverell's difcourfe tended to inftigate the people against the houfe of Hanover, and to insinuate the right of the Pretender to the throne of thefe realms. This caufed fuch a general commotion, that it became neceffary to bring him to a trial in fome way; and, contrary to all former practice refpecting a man of his rank, he was tried before the Houfe of Peers, and was filenced for 3 years upon conviction. But fo excited were the paffions of the populace in confequence of his insinuations, that they almoft adored him as a prophet, and fome of them were led to commit thofe outrages which gave rife to the following trials. 2 diffenting minifters, Messrs. Bradbury and Burgess, having made themfelves conspicuous by preaching in behalf of the revolutionary fettlement and freedom of fentiment in matters of religion, became the immediate objects of refentment of the mob. What arofe in confequence hereof will appear from the following abftract of the trials of the criminals before us. Daniel Damaree, on the 19th of April, 1710, was indicted for being concerned with a multitude of men, to the number of 500, armed with fwords and clubs, to levy war against the Queen. A gentleman depofed that, "going through the temple, he faw fome thoufands of people who had attended Dr. Sacheverell from Weftminfter Hall, that fome of them faid they would pull down Dr. Burgess's meeting houfe that night." Others differed as to the time of doing it, but all agreed on the act, and the meeting houfe was demolifhed on the following night. Captain Orill fwore that on the 1ft of March, hearing that "the mob had pulled down Dr. Burgess's meeting houfe, he refolved to go among them, and to do what fervice he could to government by making difcoveries." Captain Orill, going to Mr. Bradbury's meeting, found the people plundering it, who obliged him to pull off his hat. After this he went to Lincoln's Inn Field, where he faw a bonfire made of fome of the materials of Dr. Burgess's meeting houfe, and faw the prifoner, who twirled his hat, and faid, "Damn it, I will lead you on. God damn me, we will have all the meeting houfes down. High Church and Sacheverell, huzza!" It was proved by another evidence that the prifoner headed part of the mob, fome of whom proposed to go to the meeting houfe in Wild Street, but that this was objected to by others, who recommended going to Drury Lane, "saying that meeting houfe was worth 10 of that in Wild Street." Joseph Collier fwore that he faw the prifoner carry a brafs fconce from Dr. Burgess's meeting houfe, and throw it into the fire in Lincoln's Inn Field, huzzaing and crying, "High Church and Sacheverell." There was another evidence to prove the concern that the prifoner had in thefe illegal acts, and feveral perfons appeared in his behalf, but their testimony contradicted each other, and the jury could not credit their evidence, but brought in a fpecial verdict. George Purchas was indicted for levying war against Queen Anne, and etc., in the fame manner that Damaree had been. On this trial, Captain Orill deposed that after feeing Dr. Burgess's meeting houfe demolifhed, and a fire made in Lincoln's Inn Fields with fome of the materials thereof, he met a party of the guards, who he directed to go to Drury Lane, where a bonfire was made of the pews and other utensils, and that there was a great mob, which was difpersed by the guards; that the prifoner was very active, pushing at the breafts of the horfes with a drawn fword; that this evidence asked what he meant, telling him that in oppofing the guard he oppofed the Queen, and he would have perfuaded him to put up his fword, and go home. But inftead of taking this advice, he replied, "Damn you, who are you? For High Churchill feveral or no? I am, God damn them all," meaning the guards, "for I am as good a man as any of them all." That he then called to the mob, come on, boys, I'll lead you on. I'm for High Church and Sacheverell, and I'll lose my life in the caufe. The captain further depofed, that after this the prifoner ran refolutely with his fword in his hand, and made a full pafs at the officer who commanded the guards, and if one of the guards had not given a fpring, and beat his fword down, he would have run the officer through the left flank; that the prifoner now retired a little lower, and the guards had by this time difperfed the mob, having knocked down 40 or 50 of them in the action. Richard Ruffell, one of the guards, depofed that they were ordered by the ferjeant to march into Drury Lane, and to return their bayonets and their drawn fwords; that when they came to Drury Lane there was a bonfire with a large mob about it; that near the fire the horfe were all drawn up into one line, with their tails against the wall, that none of the mob might come behind; that the prifoner then ftood in the middle of the lane, huzzaing, and came up and would have thruft himfelf between the horfes, but the guards beat him off with the flats of their fwords. The prifoner produced fome witnefles, but as what they faid did not contradict the evidences againft him, their depofitions had no weight. The jury were fatisfied with the proofs that had arifen, but having a doubt respecting the points of law, they brought in a fpecial verdict. At the fame time and place, Francis Willis was tried for affifting in demolishing the meeting houfe of Mr. Bradbury in Fetter Lane, and burning the materials at a bonfire in Holborn, but was acquitted for want of fufficient evidence against him. The verdicts respecting Damaree and Purchas being left fpecial, their cafes were argued in the Court of King's Bench in Weftminfter Hall the following term, before Lord Chief Juftice Parker and the other judges; when, though every artifice in the law was made ufe of in their behalf, they were adjudged to be guilty, and in confequence of which they received fentence of death, and were executed at Tyburn on the 15th of June, 1710. This is the end of Volume 1, Part 3 of the New and Complete Newgate Calendar.